Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of the award winning Everything Compliance. We're absolutely thrilled for two reasons today. We have back our long lost colleague, Mr. Jonathan Armstrong, and we have a special guest, Karen Moore. Karen, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. Always happy to be here.
All right. Well, Mr. Armstrong, with your return of the prodigal son, we will ask you to lead us off.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks, listeners. Thanks, you all, and good to be back. I think you'd asked me to give a brief rundown of the EU AI Act and where we were with that at the moment. It's important to remember that despite what you read in the media and despite those tweets that we're seeing that say the act is in and people need to comply, bunkum, it isn't. But the first thing to say, I think, is that AI is not the Wild West in Europe that people think it is. We've already had a number of cases where regulators have looked at AI, usually using GDPR powers. So we've had the suspension of ChatGPT on a temporary basis, an ongoing investigation by the guarantor into ChatGPT, which may lead to a more permanent suspension. We've had the suspension of Replica AI, another chatbot. We've had fines in various European jurisdictions against Clearview AI, a facial recognition operation. And we've also had fines for food delivery apps like Foodino and Glove app in Italy and in Spain. So there's already been a significant amount of regulatory activity. And in most cases, regulators are using existing GDPR principles. So the principles of fairness, lawfulness, and transparency, particularly. And they've been fairly innovative in adapting it. So in the Foodino case, for example, they said that because the algorithm gave preferential treatment to riders and deliverers of food who would work Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the unintentional consequence of that was that the app was racially discriminatory because the Sabbath of most mainstream religions would be on a Friday, a Saturday, or a Sunday. And they also looked at things like the always-on nature of a lot of AI. So just because you can get a constant stream of where somebody is using geolocation doesn't mean to say you should. And again, I think with AI, that's one of the real messages. And I know we've discussed it before, but I've been on the NYSBA AI task force. Our report's now out. If anyone wants it, just drop me an email. But we've looked there at more of the should we rather than the can we elements of AI. I mean, one thing I think Matt's going to talk about that I'm particularly passionate about is that AI, though, because it's difficult, doesn't mean to say that many corporations can opt out. There are clear opportunities with AI. So it isn't a fact of just saying, oh, we won't go near it, because that in itself might lose competitive advantage. So with that introduction, turning to the EU AI Act, well, that reached political agreement in December 2023. It's been a somewhat fraught process. And I think it's always going to be a difficult piece of legislation because in some respects, the innovation in AI is moving faster than the politicians discussing it. So we saw changes at a very late stage proposed by countries like France and Germany because the pace of innovation was so quick. So it's going to be about 2 years since until the act is fully in force. But some organisations can volunteer to effectively sign up to the legislation early. This is the so-called AI Pact, not Act. My suspicion is that there won't be many takers for that. Those that are might be the ones in the deepest trouble. So there's an ongoing investigation, for example, into the antitrust competition law aspects of AI. And it might be that a big tech corporation that feels under pressure from an antitrust point of view might elect to join the AI Pact. But for most corporations, they'll have another 18 months or so to prepare. But that doesn't mean to say they should be complacent. Obviously, any AI application that they're building now will have to comply with the legislation if its shelf life is going to be longer than about 18 months. So it's a regulation, not a directive. So the same as GDPR, which means that in theory, the AI Act will be the same across all EU member states. As a side note, it won't apply in the UK. Rishi Sunak's on a long courtship with Mark Zuckerberg, which means that the UK is sort of going light on AI regulation. Some say it's the longest job application in history, with Sunak perhaps thinking that he's out of a job in November, and the election results this morning would have probably hastened that demise, and we'll see him no doubt brushing up his LinkedIn profile even as we speak. The Act adopts a risk-based approach. So in simple terms, it categorizes different aspects of AI, and in some respects, it adopts a similar approach to GDPR in that you'll have to do an impact assessment. You'll have to look at the potential ramifications of the AI application that you're bringing in and what you can do to minimize that. Like GDPR, the Act will have extraterritorial reach, and like GDPR, enforcement will be at member state level. And this is where we're likely to see differences throughout Europe. As I've said already, we've had the Granta in Italy and the AEPD in Spain go fairly heavy on AI enforcement. We've also had investigations in parts of Germany, in Greece, and GDPR enforcement tends to be fairly patchy, and EU AI Act enforcement is likely to be fairly patchy as well. I think there'll be a ramp-up period. Many of the regulators don't have the technical expertise that they need, so I don't think we'll see big cases initially, but I think we'll see big complaints initially. And if I was a betting man, I'd say that Max Schrems's name will be on some of those complaints. And the fines, again, similar to GDPR, but higher. So fines of up to 35 million euros or 7% of global annual revenue. So the intention is there's quite a lot of meat behind this. Now, of course, for corporations, as I've said, now is the time they're going to have to prepare. I think there are a number of issues. I've looked particularly at the issues around training data. So a lot of organizations have a fairly convoluted supply chain for their AI applications, where they're contracting oftentimes with a big tech company who's then procuring training data to train the AI application that they're then embedding. But there are some real issues there. There's one provider of data called Common Crawl that's a sort of not-for-profit, seems to have the majority of the market in training data. And some of the training data wasn't gathered for that purpose. So things like the Replica AI case tell us that there's a lot of unsuitable stuff that's being used to train chatbots. For those of you who didn't follow it, Replica AI is the chatbot that basically encouraged youngsters to engage in sexual language and sexual activity, and then was the center of a criminal case in the UK where a vulnerable individual said that Replica AI, or his Replica AI chatbot, had told him to go and kill the Queen, and he was arrested outside Windsor Castle. So he said, about to follow up on the instructions of his chatbot, and all sorts of particular issues with chatbots like that, and the alleged involvement of the Russian state in some of that activity. So I think it's not an easy job for people to make their AI applications comply. And of course, for many compliance professionals, they don't know the AI that's being used in the business. And that, again, is an issue that they're going to have to address. So if you're a chief compliance officer, you need to be knocking on the door of the tech team, asking them what AI they're deploying. I'd ask HR recruitment as well, because from my experience, that's where we're often seeing a lot of AI applications already. And you're going to have to do that diligence, I think, of reaching out to the organization to find out the applications that are already in place and retrofit compliance to them.
Jay Rosen, do you have a question for Jonathan Armstrong?
Actually, I do, and welcome back, Jonathan. Vis-a-vis your EU clients, are they being proactive or reactive in terms of what's happening in the marketplace?
Yeah, good question. I think the reality is it depends. I know that I did just before I went away, about 3 weeks ago, I did a session for one of the world's biggest tech companies that was trying to get ahead of this. And we had a really great session, I thought, looking at some of the risks and some of the opportunities. But other people are, behaving ostrich-like and thinking, I've got another 18 months, I've got another 2 years, I'll worry about it later. And again, that's a similar pattern that we had with GDPR. There was the sort of deniers and those who thought that they needed to get ahead of it. And of course, there are business opportunities sometimes with getting ahead of it as well. So it's a mixed bag, to be honest, Jay.
Thank you.
All right. Matt Kelly, what is on your mind this week?
Somewhat picking up on Jonathan's Armstrong, laying the groundwork for what are the regulatory issues here. And while it's coming out of Europe, I think the structure of the EU AI Act is probably going to be very similar to what we end up with in the United States. So I started thinking about how specifically corporate boards are trying to get a grip on their approach to artificial intelligence. So last week, I spent most of the weekend reading through corporate proxy statements because I'm that cool and exciting of a person. So it is proxy season here in the United States for companies that have a year-end fiscal date of December 31st. Right around now is when they filed their proxy statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which outline, among other things, what the board's basic approach is to governance and what the board's governance structure is. What committees does it have? What do those committees do? Things like that. So I went to a data warehouse business that I know, and I looked up the proxy statements of Fortune 500 companies that have already filed their proxies for 2023. And I just searched, what are they saying about artificial intelligence? How many of them have the words artificial intelligence somewhere in their proxy? And not a whole lot of them do. So out of the S&P 500 that I looked at, 429 had filed their proxies already. Out of the 429, 178 had mentioned artificial intelligence in some way. So that's only about 40 or 41%, if I'm doing my math right. Most of them did not mention artificial intelligence. And maybe there are other proxies from other companies not in my sample that have, but right now, clearly, the majority aren't talking about AI. But within the 178 who, the board is at least mentioning AI, most of them tend to mention it only in a very cursory way. A lot of times I found that there was an introductory letter from the CEO about the proxy or from the board chairman saying, we're doing all sorts of fun and innovative things and we're making great products and we're thinking about artificial intelligence and blah, 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 blah. And that's all. That was it. Just a passing mention of artificial intelligence. Only a very small handful actually talked about how the board is engaging with AI in any substantive way, where they said, we are giving it to the audit committee. We are giving it to a risk committee of some kind, which handles technology risks rather than the audit committee. Even then, most of them who were talking about AI to that extent, most of them still said, yeah, the audit committee takes care of that. And a couple of them only mentioned it in the form of shareholder proposals that also get included in the proxy, where these shareholder activists were filing proposals that the board should direct the company to publish some report about AI. And I think I found about half a dozen of those examples. And out of the half a dozen, all half dozen, the board said, we oppose this. Nobody actually stepped forward and said, this shareholder proposal is good. We think that there should be an AI report. So this is a long-winded way of me saying most of the boards that I have found aren't really talking about how they're handling AI. And I suspect that's because most of them don't know what they want to do. And it's really interesting that you see this interlocking problem here, that if the boards don't know what they want to do with AI, they're largely going to leave it to management. And my question would be, is that sufficient? Because clearly AI is a hugely influential technology. So should the board have some oversight of it? If it should, what should that oversight be? If the board should, do you have the right board directors to be able to have an intelligent conversation? I did come across a fair number of companies that talked about board director candidates. Those get listed in the proxy too. And they mention that so-and-so is a director candidate, they have this experience, and they have experience with AI. So some boards are trying to think through, we should have directors who know what to do with AI. Then maybe they could have a more intelligent process within the board about how much do we want to oversee this? How much do we want to let management oversee it? But another big question I have is just, is artificial intelligence going to be viewed as more of a risk? And specifically, like, is it a cyber risk? Is it a privacy risk? That's how the board sees it. So we're going to give it to a committee on the board, like the audit committee, or maybe a technology committee, because they're in charge of thinking about cyber risk or privacy risk. And do we have the controls for it? But that seems to me that that's a diminished view of what AI really could be. So is a board going to see it as a bigger thing, that this could transform our whole business? This could give us all sorts of opportunities. This could raise ethical questions that maybe an audit committee shouldn't be the ones answering it. And so the full board should handle it. Now, I think that's a good idea, but we investors, we consumers, we stakeholders outside the company, if it's the full board talking about the strategic implications of AI, we don't necessarily what those conversations are. At least if it's going to the audit committee does publish an annual report saying, well, we did this and we did that, and we had training about how AI risks are, and we looked at the testing for AI. Well, that's something, and that helps an investor, except the company has already said, or the board has already said, we only look at AI as a technology risk, and that confines and constrains what AI could be. So it really is, like I said, this interlocking dilemma. What is management allowed to do with AI? What should the board do for AI? If the board is going to do something with AI, do they see it as a big picture thing for the whole board? Or do they see AI as a little picture thing that goes off to this committee over here? I was astonished to see that a lot of very large tech companies, Google, Apple, I think Microsoft, they all have like only a basic board structure of nominating and governance committee, compensation committee, audit committee, but they don't have a special tech committee. Facebook, for example, does have a privacy committee. So are they going to think about AI? Because wouldn't that really mean that AI is just a big privacy risk? I think AI is more than that. Just last week, Facebook said we're putting oodles of money into building data centers for more AI. That doesn't sound like it's something that only at the board, especially when we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Microsoft, I stand corrected. Microsoft, now that I recall, does have a environmental, social, and policy committee. And it does list artificial intelligence as an issue there, but it says responsible use of AI. I'm all for responsible use of AI, but again, that says that it's just a small thing to be managed, not a transformational technology to be seized upon. So is the full board of Microsoft also going to be thinking about those bigger issues? If it is, do we get to see what that is as investors? Do we rely on what management is saying? And management at a lot of these companies, they're putting out statements about how they view AI. But, it points at some very basic questions of governance and who is in charge of what as the biggest technology we have seen since the invention of, the ballpoint pen has come along. And right now it looks to me like boards are still struggling with trying to figure that answer out. I don't know what the right answer is either. And if listeners out there have thoughts, I'd love for you to chime in with what do you think boards should be doing? What should the company be doing? How much is this a business technology that the first line of defense and senior executives get to run? How much is it a risk that the second line of defense or the internal audit team get to keep in check? And are we have any clarity on this whatsoever? And right now it looks to me like the answer is no.
Karen Moore, do you have a question or comment for Matt?
Yeah, I do. I mean, Matt, you touched on my two big questions already, which is my constant soapbox of board competency and board committees, because there seems to me it hasn't really kept up to date. And if things keep going to the audit committee and you expand and expand, where's the competency? If you're looking at financial acumen being the driving factor for placement on the audit committee, you're really not covering the bases when you get to risks generated by AI, data privacy, and some of the others. So, developing a separate risk committee, or I would almost argue for a data governance committee, because that's becoming increasingly critical for companies. I don't know if you came across any unusual committee compositions there, because I do think it's both a question of competence of the individuals, but also the scope of the charter of a committee to make decisions. As AI infiltrates an organization, as organizations outsource things that are being accomplished through AI, which they may not have any insight for. I mean, have you seen anybody doing anything that is trying to address this outside of companies like Facebook and Microsoft?
Well, yes and no. A couple of years ago now, so my memory is a bit rusty and out of date, but a couple of years ago, I did look at how many large companies have some sort of board level technology risk committee to handle these sorts of things without putting it upon the audit committee. And I think that is a real threat. And compliance officers could appreciate this, because when you go and brief the audit committee, we all know this, that for the last 2 hours of their meeting, they've been talking with the auditor about the audit. And you get in there for like 3 minutes, and the audit committee will basically say, is anybody being subpoenaed right now? No? Great job. We'll see you in 4 months. That's really most audit committees' oversight of the compliance function most of the time. And my fear is that we would fall into a similar bad habit with artificial intelligence. Both of these things, compliance and corporate culture and whatnot, and artificial intelligence, need more attention from the board than that. And I don't fault the audit committees, because they're already overworked. So you don't necessarily see enough large companies. I mean, I want to say maybe about 1 in 4 or 5, when I last looked at this, had some sort of technology or public policy or ESG or tech risk committee, something that thought about risks that were related somehow to compliance, but that committee was not part of the audit committee. But they were still all over the map. And a lot of those committees arose more from ESG, or they arose specifically around cybersecurity. So if it's an ESG committee, can you shoehorn artificial intelligence into that? Maybe, but you're shoehorning it. If it's a technology committee, that's better. But still, most of those arose from cybersecurity risk, or they arose from privacy risk. And I would say almost inherently, you are defining that as a compliance thing where we're going to constrain AI to make sure it doesn't cause regulatory problems. That's not the same as thinking through What are the ethical issues of AI? What are the financial implications for embracing AI? And maybe those issues are big enough that they don't belong on a committee. They do belong on a full board. So I don't know, but Karen, I would say one other final point. By coincidence, just the other day, I was talking with a compliance person at a large insurance concern where they were thinking more on the in-house side, not at the board, but they had developed a team that had originally been thinking around privacy and data governance, and that had been in the 2010s. And they realized this is where artificial intelligence oversight should also reside, is with this team. And I don't know how many people were on the team, but it was numerous full-time employees whose job was to think through privacy controls, privacy regulations, cybersecurity issues as we are gathering data, we're validating data, we're making sure we're doing that properly. Oh, here comes AI. Well, it's going to consume a lot of data. We should make that part of this team's oversight too. That is the in-house analog of what I think boards will need to develop, certainly by like 2030 and ideally by next month. And a lot of boards, I'm not sure they're on that maturity curve yet.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a question or comment for Matt?
No, you're muted.
You're on mute, Jonathan.
That was on purpose, actually. No, other than I think Matt brings up some really great points. And, I think one of the things that we're going to have to really take a step back on, as Matt said, is, how are the boards going to be able to monitor this, going forward? And how does that seep through the organization? I'm going to talk about this in my segment, but there are some groups out there that shall be nameless that are trying to pilot some of this. So it's going to be interesting to see how effective that is. And then, I guess my question for Matt is, my big fear always, and I think Karen, you mentioned this maybe indirectly or indirectly, my memory's sort of bad these days, but it's, if you don't have the right individuals that are responsible for this, and you have this over reliance on artificial intelligence, either at the board level or any other level, I think that's a recipe for disaster. So I just wanted your thoughts.
Well, I think so too, and it gets to yet another fundamental question about board governance is, who are you, the board, relying on from management to brief you on what these issues are? And for a lot of emerging issues, I think the CEO is going to try and really keep a very tight spigot on that information pipeline, and he or she will be the one who briefs the board on these things, even if the board has the wherewithal to say, we want to report on AI, who should that be? Should it be the head of IT security? Should it be the chief technology officer? Who's going to get to make that decision? And I think a lot of times the CEO is going to step up and say, you know what, I'll tell you what you need to know about that. I'm very uncomfortable with that idea, but it certainly happens all the time in large companies. Partly because I'm not sure that a lot of large companies have a good grasp on who is in charge of AI development in-house either. So maybe by default, the CEO is going to do this bad habit. I think it is still a very muddy mess.
Look, I think we still have a problem with people understanding the definition of internal control.
Yeah.
I think the other issue we have is that there's a lot of shadow AI as well. Just as we have shadow IT, people in the organization are going out and picking their own solutions. And it's, as I said, it's a really difficult job for the chief compliance officer to know who's doing what. And then you compound it with the fact that most boards aren't appropriately set up to look at the risk. And we've said it on these podcasts endlessly. Boards need to be more diverse. That's diversity of background, it's diversity of origin, but it's diversity of skills as well. And we tend to have cookie cutter, pale, male, stale directors. And we need to change that. And that's one of the reasons. But there is, to declare an interest, obviously one of the things I'm doing at Elevate is to try and look at the next generation of non-exec directors. But there is this real skills gap. I know EY did a survey in 2022 where they said that 35% of boards admitted that they lacked an understanding of AI-related risk. And 61% of Fortune 100 companies were seeking cybersecurity expertise on their board. And tech isn't something that boards do well. From my experience, we've had a data breach, for example, where you've got a 70-plus-year-old lead non-exec director who, for various reasons, has to take, control of the investigation. And at the first meeting, I have to help him switch his iPad on. These are people who are not digital natives. And if we had a board composition that didn't include anybody with financial expertise, and we said, we leave all that to the auditors and we just trust them, you'd be regarded as a lunatic. And yet we make the same mistakes with having nobody on the board who can assess risk and opportunity with AI, with cybersecurity, with Internet of Things, all sorts of other tech-related risks and opportunities for boards. But they've got to get with the program, and boards have got to modernize. It's critical for them.
It's funny, Jonathan Armstrong, your point, if the company just said, we don't do anything about the finances, we just listen to the auditor and what the CFO tells us, not only would you have a big mess, like you'd have the SEC on hold on line one. That is just terrible. And I do think soon enough, regulators, either in the United States or in Europe, also, if you say something so glib and you're so cavalier with AI, you're going to have regulators holding on line two about that lack of oversight. And it is something that I am fully confident most boards are aware that there is a maturity curve they need to get on and get up fast. But I don't know how many of them are going to get up that curve at the appropriate speed, which I think is going to be a pretty high gear. And we shall see.
Correct.
All right. Karen Moore, what's on your mind this week?
Oh, well, even though I'm trying to keep a really broad eye on a whole number of things, I keep getting caught out by surprise. So what's on my mind is the somewhat unexpected April 7th proposal by Republican Representative Kathy Rogers and Democrat Senator Maria Cantwell proposing an American Privacy Rights Act. So we've got both a bipartisan and bicameral proposal. It's early days, but it seems to have gotten some pretty good traction in legislative discussions mid-April. So we'll see. So I wanted to try and get a little ahead of the curve and take a look at the complexities of this proposal, many of which I'm sure will change, but particularly as they relate to artificial intelligence. And I'm going to start with what I think is kind of a fun one, which is part of the preemption clause. The current draft does contain a preemption clause that says this is going to be a federal law and state laws are no longer going to apply, which California, among others, is obviously not happy about. So we might see some further dilution of that. There are already a set of listed exceptions, but the AI related one that I like, which seems bizarrely specific, is that the preemption clause would not preclude actions pursued under state criminal laws that, I wrote the language down here, that intimate images, including authentic or generated by a computer or by artificial intelligence, known to be consensual, would not be superseded by the act. So I guess if there are any naughty images that have been generated by AI that involve your personal rights somehow, that could still be pursued under state criminal laws. I kind of like that was one of the two really specific AI references in the entirety of the act. So, okay. The bigger one that's specifically referenced pertains to automated decision-making, which will then implicate changes potentially to the way a lot of companies are operating. The automated decision-making provisions define covered algorithms, which include those that have been created by or with the involvement of AI. and which make decisions with or without human intervention, which I know is a big part of some of the privacy laws, and particularly one of the key bugbears in the EU. But if they're used to make a determination regarding the provision of services or products or ranking. I have the language here: ordering, promoting, recommending, amplifying, or similarly determining the delivery or display of information to an individual. There are a whole bunch of requirements that are then imposed. And because automated decision making is starting to become a really common use by a large range of operations with a company. And I think, Jonathan Armstrong, you already referred to this in the context of the AI Act in the EU, is that there are a lot of parts of the organization that aren't even aware that they're using automated decision making. So trying to collect those all in and then deciding how we're going to make sure that we're complying if this remains as is with the APRA will be interesting, because if you are using any covered algorithm, which is pretty broadly defined, the developers first of all have to conduct a design evaluation prior to the release of the algorithm. And then the companies who are using that algorithm have to provide a notice that that algorithm is being used. And most importantly, I think, and difficult to manage, an opportunity for the individual to opt out of the use of that algorithm. Now, that is limited to what are called consequential decisions. And those are decisions, there is kind of a heavy civil rights, human rights element to that, because those consequential decisions are decisions relating to the access to equal employment, housing, employment, education, enrollment, healthcare, insurance, credit, et cetera. So it will be somewhat limited, but managing an opt-out, I'm going to say, is akin to, managing the data subject access requests, that you're going to have this kind of complexity of how are you actually going to organize that, and maybe need to even use an AI model in order to manage the notice and opt-out itself. And then I think equally importantly, and potentially somewhat burdensome, is the obligation, if you're using one of these covered algorithms, to conduct an impact assessment, which we're seeing more and more often in different contexts, especially in privacy laws. That impact assessment would, in the AI context, need to provide a pretty detailed description of the design process, the methodology, contain a statement of purpose, a description of the data used to train the model, which is maybe more or less fine, but the decision-making process itself, from my understanding, tends to be somewhat part of a black box and very hard. The explainability component can be really difficult. And then the people that are using these kind of algorithms also have to demonstrate the steps that they're taking to prevent harm to minors, which is a pretty big focus of the draft law generally, bias and access to needs like, again, housing, education, or public accommodation. So that automated decision-making component, I think, is a really big one. It's going to be interesting to see how that survives various iterations of this draft. And then we've got two carved out groups in the APRA with a slightly elevated level of accountability or responsibility. One both really not surprising. One being high impact social media companies. Those are defined as companies that provide internet-based services that individuals use in individual or user-shared content. You have to have more than 300 million individuals monthly and more than 3 billion in global annual revenue. So I guess we can identify who these high-impact social media companies are. In those cases, the browsing data is automatically classified as sensitive data or sensitive information, which is going to impact its use in modeling and also transfer and use by data brokers. So there's another kind of AI implication there. And then the second carved out group are what is identified as large data holders. Loosely, those are entities with annual revenues in excess of 250 million. and that are processing the information of more than 5 million individuals. So you can see some pretty large companies are going to get caught up in that. There's a kind of elevated impact assessment on the algorithms that is implicated there. If those algorithms pose a risk of consequential risk of harm to the individual. I can see a lot of healthcare companies and providers there, and there's some increased transparency obligations. So again, just things that need to be moved on. And then the third kind of really large bucket that is touches on artificial intelligence in the APRA. It doesn't specifically mention it, but there are data minimization requirements. Those data minimization requirements are not unusual to anybody working with GDPR. They're kind of common principles that are already seen in both the GDPR, CPRA, and others. So data minimization is important, but this is kind of a blanket one. Data minimization really informs the least amount of information needed to accomplish a stated purpose. So you're supposed to now limit the information that you're collecting. I don't know about you, but it feels like these days, if I'm even buying theater tickets online, they're asking for my blood type and all sorts of other information, completely unnecessary to my forking over a huge amount of cash for the opportunity to see Ralph Fiennes perform Macbeth, which we had the privilege of doing last week. So that was kind of nice. But signing up for supermarket loyalty programs, it just becomes kind of excessive. So the data minimization principles do make sense, but they do have potential, arguably negative consequences for artificial intelligence. Developers who are creating and training models need robust and pretty significant data. So the more you minimize the data, arguably, the more difficult it is to come up with data sets that can accomplish what they need to accomplish. The responses to that have been to use anonymized or aggregated data set, so you can still minimize the data or minimize the impact. You can locally host some of the language modeling that's being used so that it's not being aggregated specifically. So there are all sorts of technical solutions to data minimization and AI models, but it's arguably difficult or makes AI development and use of data sets more problematic. Potentially, I've seen some interesting commentary coming out of the EU, potentially creating more biased data sets because the data is limited. So I don't know. The tension between data minimization and AI is not new, or it's not brand new, at least raised by this. It's something that's been grappled with in the EU for a while, with GDPR throwing up all sorts of challenges. That tension between data minimization and creating robust data sets for AI usage has been around for a while. I've got a couple of really interesting articles. Tom, I can provide you if you want to stick the links up on the site. There's some interesting IBM research out of Haifa University, and there was also a pretty good comprehensive with examples article by Sarah Goldberg at IAPP, or shoot me an email and I can send them. So where we are on this is still very early days. Implications for AI are there. All we have, as usual, the EU is taking the lead here. All we have in the US right now is really comprehensively an executive order regarding AI, which says that privacy has got to be paramount if we're developing AI legislation. So it remains to be seen what the AI implications of the APRA will be, or how the APRA will progress, if it will progress. I'm hoping it will progress, because even an imperfect federal data privacy law is going to be better than 50 state different direction privacy laws. But we'll see where it goes. I mean, a couple of things. One is I am a bad predictor, because I made all sorts of noise about the CSDDD when it first came out, and then I months later predicted its demise as Germany and Italy were strongly opposing it, only for it to come back to life really quickly. So who knows how quickly this may or may not pass through the process. I will note that the current draft only provides 180 days to implementation. So starting to think about this now isn't a bad thing, especially if you aren't already looking at the EU AI Act and GDPR. If those don't apply to you, you might want to start taking a look at this. If you're already looking at GDPR and the EU AI Act, you're probably way ahead of the curve already, depending on where we go with the APRA. So we'll see. The two need to work in tandem, but the concept of comprehensive and integrated data governance for large corporations, I think, is becoming more and more important. We can't leave this all to the compliance officer to address. That's where we are.
All right, Mr. Marks, you've been lurking around with some comments and questions. What do you have for us?
So let's, kind of push all this aside for a second, and we'll talk about artificial intelligence, sort of optimizing internal controls and how that might play out. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've spoken about how it's being increasingly acknowledged for its disruptive potential in the field of obviously controls and within the dynamic realm of corporate governance. So I'll get into some of that, but, going back to what I said before, internal control, according to me, is a process of interlocking activities designed to support the policies and procedures, that detail the specific, preventive, detective, and so on and so forth. Moreover, policies and procedures serve as the raw material for internal control, which is a process rather than an object. But AI in itself, when you take a look at this, has the capability of quickly and precisely scrutinizing vast amounts of data. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And so you can almost revolutionize the execution of some controls, not all controls, some controls. And so, the current role of artificial intelligence, I think I might have mentioned before that there are some internal audit shops that are playing around with that. But I think for our listeners today, I really want to get into, sort of methods for successfully at least starting our execution, because I think we talked around some of these ideas, some of our other thought leaders on today's call, our podcast. So to optimize, at least in my mind, the way I'm thinking about this, the impact of AI and internal controls, I would look at first data quality and accessibility. What are the sources of truth? The cornerstone of any successful AI application is the data that is of superior quality and that is available to us. If that doesn't happen, everything else is useless. So organizations must ensure that data is inputted into AI systems in both accurate and a comprehensive way to prevent incorrect outputs that can potentially undermine specific control mechanisms. And again, speaking from the hip here, and then we talked about from before, having the right people. So skill development. I think that's really critical too. I think it's essential to develop internal capabilities to effectively handle these AI tools and accurately analyze these results, which means that some of this is going to be trial and error. You're going to be building models. You might be using machine learning and natural language processing and things like that. So there's some sensitivity around all of that as well. But it's going to take folks not only to understand what these things are, but to speak up if they're not working or they're not as effective as they potentially can be. So I think that, that's really sort of data quality is one, skill development, and then I sort of led into this sort of that ethical considerations and the bias mitigation, so I do think it's imperative to acknowledge and tackle the ethical ramifications and inherent biases that present themselves in certain AI algorithms. So you're really going to have people that understand this. So it's crucial to create, AI systems that are open, fair, and responsible in order to preserve what we'll call stakeholder trust and upheld, the ethical norms of the organization. And then the last thing that I think probably we should really consider is the collaboration piece of this. And I think a lot of organizations are forgetting about that. It's like when you do a system install, you just can't buy a system off the shelf usually and plug it in and think it's going to work. There's a lot of collaboration that goes back and forth with the tool provider or the system provider. So partnering with respected, technology providers in this particular space, and providing companies with customized solutions that meet their specific internal requirements, I think is probably a good thing to start thinking about and doing. And then these collaborations, based on what I've seen over my career, can offer continuous assistance to the company, as the intelligence and as the capabilities really emerge. So, I think it could be really great. I think if you're in internal audit today and you're thinking about internal controls, I think if you're not at least starting to think about how you can infuse this technology into your controls and use that as an advantage, through continuous auditing or continuous monitoring type protocols that you might have, you're going to get lost. And it may become a level of maybe somewhat an expectation that these things are starting to meander their way into the internal audit realm, either shortly or at least more prevalent, predominantly, as we see cases like this one financial institution, start to publish or come out where they have been successful in dealing with these transaction reviews and using, natural language and machine learning and artificial intelligence to really tackle some of the more critical things with regards to, like, for example, I live in the world of fraud, developing patterns or trends or anomalies. AI, if it's going to continuously learn, those are some of the things that are going to happen more quickly than probably a human could do. So there are some really significant advantages of really thinking about this. But I think, to kind of cut to the chase, because I know we're kind of short on time today, the incorporation of artificial intelligence into internal controls, at least from my perspective, represents really pivotal advancements in effectively managing the intricate nature of organizations and the vast amount of data that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. You can really improve your control mechanisms and make more informed decisions by implementing AI technology properly. And I use that word properly because, again, I think it's like anything. If you have, garbage in, garbage out. So in the future, the deliberate integration of AI into internal controls, I think, will be a crucial factor in determining the success and effectiveness, of an organization's overall governance. So, I think the boards really need to be educated on this and how it can play a key role in enhancing the control environment as companies work more towards what I call a risk-resilient enterprise-wide ecosystem. And so these are just some of the things that I'm thinking about with regards to AI and internal controls. And I think, based on what, Jonathan has put forth and what Matt has put forth and what Karen's put forth, I think those things really need to be understood and thought through as well as we enter this new realm.
All right, Jay Rosen, what's on your mind?
Well, thanks, Tom. I'm going to be talking about AI like most everyone touched on this morning. And I wanted to start off with an oldie but goodie. Does anybody remember receiving an urgent email or text saying that your boss or CEO of the company needs you to purchase $2,100 Starbucks gift cards? This was a very unsophisticated but believable fraud that happened in the early aughts. The era of artificial assistance in corporate crime is now here, and compliance departments must ensure that they're prepared. Last month, the Department of Treasury issued a detailed report highlighting that AI is redefining cybersecurity and the fraud in the financial services sector. Here's a recent example. A Hong Kong office of an unnamed multinational recently lost $25 million when several fraudsters joined a live video conference posing as firm personnel. They already deceived the employees on the call by using deepfake software to impersonate colleagues, including the firm's CFO. Companies' existing compliance programs and business risk mitigation policies may no longer be sufficient to address emerging AI risks. There are three key areas that I'd like to talk about this morning: real-time deepfakes, AI-enabled barrier evasion, and manipulation of the company's AI models. These three areas arise from the availability of new tools, but the tactics are well known to corporate compliance personnel. Several corporate mitigation strategies can allow companies to address these new, rapidly expanding threats. First of all, deep fake technology, which convincingly replaces audio or video of one person's likeness with the likeness of another, and they have introduced a new wrinkle to these schemes. Threat actors often impersonate a company executive or vendor and use a fake or hacked email to trick a company's employees into sending money. Training efforts have therefore emphasized email as a vehicle for potential fraud and mitigation policies. Deepfakes have amplified the risk of impersonation. Instead of an email, suppose a target employee receives a text message from the CFO directing the employee to join the call. Preventing improper access to sensitive information is a task similar to many corporate compliance departments. AI tools have made it easier for bad actors to discover these gaps. Corporate chatbots, for instance, can be given access to internal corporate data that employees access by chatting with AI systems. A chatbot given access to these sensitive data might divulge in response to a routine prompt without employees even knowing the possibility. Lastly, AI systems are being increasingly relied upon to drive vital business processes such as sales and investment models. Companies' recent shift to AI-enabled key performance indicators, for instance, means that AI systems are being used to gain a holistic sense of their business performances. Here's a couple of other examples of what could go wrong. Rogue employees might try to tamper with these systems, for example, manipulating algorithms and artificially boosting their performance matrix. Here's a mitigation strategy for deep fakes. To address the risk associated, companies should consider implementing the following measures. First of all, from a training perspective, employees who transfer large sums of money and send out confidential information or handle passwords should be trained in deepfake technology. These employees should be trained that any request made by audio or video could be fraudulent, and it has one of the following hallmarks. One, it arises from a typical source. Two, it involves a large sum of money or highly sensitive information. An employee keeps the request confidential or is asked to not tell anyone, and then an element of urgency like the initial example above. All these involve transfers of funds to a new bank account or confidential information to an unfamiliar address. Training should also include ways to detect real-time video deepfakes, like asking the person to turn to the side, as the current technology struggles to generate realistic profile views. Any suspicious request should be independently viewed by one or more of the following means. A person should be face-to-face for verification. The requester may display or may be asked to display two pieces of identification, implementing in predetermined code words or challenge questions, and requiring a second person to sign off on certain categories. Companies should ensure that existing information walls and permissions are applied to the data made available by the systems. Companies should follow the least privilege principles by limiting access to sensitive information only to those employees who genuinely need to interact with it. And finally, companies can use red teaming, which is a process of engaging a team of experts to probe systems of vulnerabilities. Here's to access the threat of model manipulation. Companies, departments may consider the following policies. Dual authorizations. Companies can limit the amount of single employees to a certain system, and this improves their ability to detect improper changes as well as inadvertent errors made by the system. The maker-checker process, for example, requires that a checker approve any changes that seem to be implemented to the system. All tools for their promise also provide evolving ways to exploit a company's vulnerability and to compromise their systems for personal benefits. Corporate compliance departments should consider these heightened risks in their evolving AI situations and include risk mitigation as they plan their strategies. So hopefully by taking some of these actions, we will avoid the situation of being asked to go out and get Starbucks gift cards. Tom?
All right. We are off to our fan favorite shout outs and rants. Mr. Kelly is facing a hard stop, so we're going to ask you to go first, Matt. Then we'll go back to the same order.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. First, I have two rants, actually. A very quick one on the American Privacy Rights Act, which, if you shorten that to an acronym, is APRA. That's terrible. Clearly, this law should have been called the American Right to Privacy Act, which would then be pronounced ARPA. And I can't believe they missed that. That is yet another sign of America's political dysfunction in the Capitol. But actually, I wanted to spend more of my time ranting about South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who is making headlines this week for a book she is trying to publish, which has not even been published yet. It has already been panned for one of the stories in the books where apparently she talks about a puppy that she had that could not be trained, so she took it out back and shot it. And I just have to say, in full disclosure, I am not a dog person. I do not like the dog that we have in my family. I don't dislike him either, but I'm certainly not going to take a dog out and shoot it. And maybe the people who do care for dogs could tell me if I'm wrong, but I thought if you had a dog that was not trainable, you would give it away to somebody else who could better handle the dog. And I get it. If you have a family with small children, you don't want a dangerous dog on your property. I would put the dog on somebody else's property who wanted it and who could handle the dog. I would not put the dog in a gravel pit with a .22 slung over my shoulder. So there are some other problems in her book, apparently, that she claims that she had met the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un. It has since been proven that actually she never has. And now her spokesman is saying that the publisher is going to correct inaccuracies in the books by the time it's published. It just seems to me that she has made a very poor start to what obviously was a vice presidential nominee. I don't think that's going to happen. I think she's lost the dog caucus. I think she's probably lost the North Korean dictator caucus too. I don't know who else is left for her trying to get her onto the vice presidential ticket. But anyways, I just think that she is not ready for prime time. And as bad as your life might be, people, it could be worse. You could be her dog. And that's all I have to say this week.
Where's Sarah Palin when you need her? Jonathan Armstrong, you've had 3 weeks to think up an appropriate commentary. What do you have for us?
Well, you'll be surprised to know I haven't been thinking about this for the whole of the 3 weeks. But I think the last time we were on, I criticized Kate Middleton for the way in which she had handled this Photoshop debacle. And it's right and proper that I say that she's handled the news of her cancer diagnosis with great dignity and in a entirely appropriate and professional way. And my thoughts and prayers are with her and her family.
Karen Moore, what do you have for us?
I've got a shout out to the Buffalo Bills, who selected former rugby union player 23-year-old Travis Clayton in the 7th round of the draft. He's going to play offensive lineman, or at least tried. He has never played a game of football before. He's coming through the International Player Pathway Program. I think he's the 2nd rugby player to do so, but maybe the first who's never played rugby before. I do have it on reliable information that the Scouts very often are looking at track and field athletes for speed, but that has not been a really successful outcome because they're just not used to getting tackled. If you're running a fast mile, you are not doing it with any obstruction. So Travis Clayton did clock 4.79 seconds in the 40-yard dash in the draft combine. He's certainly used to getting tackled, so I'm going to wish Travis Clayton a lot of success. But really, shout out to the Buffalo Bills for, some mild risk taking and thinking out of the box.
Jonathan Marks.
Hi. I'm going to give a shout out to Miss Maureen Stanko, who lives not too far from a town that I spend many years of my life in Pennsylvania, and her son Nick, who is 20 and is on the autism spectrum. And Maureen did something that I think is absolutely remarkable. She actually opened up a cafe. It's called So Much to Give Inclusive Cafe in Pennsylvania. And they employ about 60 people. 80% of the employees have a disability, and they work as greeters, food runners, sous chefs, dishwashers, and servers. And people with disabilities now actually go there to hang out and have a meal because they feel very comfortable. And I just think what she has done is absolutely just fantastic. And so the next time I'm in the area, I will guarantee you, Maureen, that I will stop by and patronize your facility and give you a little donation. Thank you for doing that. It's quite remarkable, like I said.
Jay Rosen.
I will also have a sports-related shout-out in saying that this is my favorite time of the year because you have the NBA and the NHL playoffs, you have the WNBA, you have Major League Baseball, and as Karen knows, after the draft, we're going to have organized team activities. So I just invite everybody to go and geek out and watch some sports.
Well, I'm going to shout out to the Pinball Wizard, Pete Townsend, and at least in my top 5 albums of all time, the rock opera Tommy, which has reappeared on Broadway in 2024, introducing a new generation of listeners to, in my mind, one of the greatest albums of all time. It has been nominated for Best Revival of a Musical. It was first made into a musical in 1993, and that version won 5 Tony Awards. The album has been introduced, or rather inducted, into the Grammy Hall of Fame. I can't believe there's a living human being that doesn't have that album, but apparently there are people who didn't or weren't teenagers in the 60s and 70s. So shout out to Pete Townsend. Shout out to the Pinball Wizard with the greatest acoustic guitar opening solo of all time. And shout out to the first rock opera.
Can I just say, Tom, I was privileged to go and see The Who live for what might have been their farewell tour last summer, and he's not lost it.
I saw that same tour, and you're correct. So with that, thanks, everyone. I can't wait till we get together next time.